If you clicked on this video, then you know why you're here, and probably already heard about the 5090's performance and it being lackluster. Even at 4K on flat screen, it's only about 30% on average over the 4090 and makes no sense in buying for VR if you already got one, right? Wrong. Very wrong. What if I told you that if you're on a high-resolution VR headset, in some cases, the 5090 has potential to provide a similar leap as the 3090 to 4090, and in some cases, much, much higher than that. Yes, your ears are working. I said a jump bigger than what the 4090 provided. No, it is not because of the VRAM. You're probably already calling me a liar or wondering how that's possible when it's not much of a leap on flat screen. So let's not waste any time and jump into the benchmarks to prove it, shall we? We'll talk about why this is the case after looking at the charts and providing some context rather than just hearing me yap before any evidence of such wild claims comes up. But for context, my testing setup comprises the 7950X3D Affinity Master of the Vcache cores, RTX 4090 and 5090, 64 gigabytes of 6000 MHz CL30 DDR5 RAM, and then the Quest 3 with Virtual Desktop Ultra with H.264 200 megabytes run at 100, 200, 300, and 400% resolution in Steam VR. Unless performance is so low, there's just no point. You may already be asking, why would I do this? Well, good question. It's because we have some really high-resolution headsets recently released or that are coming up. At company default render res, the Pimax Crystal is 4312 by 5100 per eye. The Megane X is a little over 4K by 4K, at least from what I heard on CES. And then there's the Play for Dream, which is using the same panels. Then there's stuff like the Crystal Super, which has a truly horrific 100% res. Look at that damn number! Comparatively, the 3000 by 3000-ish of VD at Ultra is, next to the high end for VR, not that big of a number anymore. And until we have those headsets to test, this is the closest possible ballpark that can be done. Yes, compositor efficiency will matter, so don't take this as a one-to-one. You'll get this performance on every headset. Virtual Desktop's compositor seems quite efficient. I tested it in another video. So it should be a good ballpark for how a headset could perform ideally. Plus, there's also the fact that number of games I tested, I was 2 Hz limited at 100%, because in VR, you can only render up to what your headset's Hz rate is. I can't tell it to render as much FPS as possible like flat screen can, so that's why I got a test like this. I've specifically noted runs where I was noticeably Hz limited. I chose VD over Steam Link or Meta's native software as, firstly, Steam Link, even at 500% resolution, was unironically too low for the 5090 in some of these games. And I have not had good experiences with Meta software, and it just didn't seem very efficient either. I did want to use a wired DisplayPort headset like the Crystal here to avoid any potential wireless issues, even though I do have a good setup with a Wi-Fi 6E router, dedicated Ethernet cord, and high-end equipment. But the 5090 currently has some real issues with certain headsets, including my main one right here. More on that at the end of the video. But one major thing, and people doing benchmarks should really watch out for this one, is I had the NVIDIA app turn on smooth motion by itself, not once, not twice, 3 times during my benchmarking, which screwed up some of my early results, including one teaser I did post later. I apologize for that. And I had to end up rerunning results several times because of it. No, smooth motion does not appear to work properly in VR before you ask. It just makes CapFrameX, which I use for benchmarking, think it does. Don't use it. But speaking of those bugs, one last thing to note is certain key games part of my normal testing suite would not play nice with the new driver or the updated CapFrameX software, giving me problems ranging from inconsistently crashing, making replicable runs too difficult, in the case with Alex, to flat out not launching for me anymore, such as RE8 and MSFS 2020. Which I know a lot of people are probably hoping to see that one. I spent a long time troubleshooting and trying to fix it to no avail, so if you're sad about some missing games, that's why, and I did my best, guys. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll be able to fix it for the next video. Now, let's check out some of these charts, shall we? First up is Project Wingman. One quick note on this though, it has the FSR mod applied, as I forgot uninstalling a game doesn't always remove custom files in the folder. This included the mod for FSR, and I only realized that after I ran everything, so this is the only game like this, but it does also show an example of how the cards can perform with upscaling. Dedicated video on that coming eventually. 100% was solidly hertz limited on both cards, so not really much to say there, but things get immediately different at 200% res. The 5090 was still hertz limited at 120 FPS, and its 1% low were over 100 though, but next to the 4090 barely being below 90 FPS average and only 79 FPS 1% low, that's a meaningful jump for the 5090, though not the biggest margin of 33 and 28% respectively. The 0.1% low though, interestingly, don't see that much of a leap. Moving on to 300% res though, the 5090 begins to really show why its memory bandwidth matters. Its lead has gone up to 51% on average FPS and plus 44% on the 1% low versus the 4090. And in VR, the fact the 5090 can maintain above 90 FPS average while the 4090 is at 63 is huge because of how important meeting your target hertz rate is. Once again though, the 0.1% low show a smaller but still widening gap, as the 5090 has a 23% advantage versus the 17 it had prior. Honestly rather funny to see, but the 5090 at 300% res is performing slightly better than the 4090 at 200%. That should say a lot. And 400% is just an awful unplayable experience on the 4090, as it can't even hold 45 FPS average, yet the 5090 is flexing even more by managing a 77 FPS average, leapfrogging the 4090 with a whopping 73% increase. The relatively modest gap from 200% has literally more than doubled, and it now feels like a worthy successor to the precedent that the 4090 set over the 3090. This isn't even just academic either. The 5090's frame rates are totally playable, good even. In fact, even more hysterical is that when comparing the 5090's 400% performance to the 4090's 200%, the 4090's metrics are only around 13 to 17% better, which is kind of mind-blowing with literally double the render resolution at play. Just to check the frame time plot out of curiosity on this, we can see that the overall frame time stability is comparable on both. And remember, lower is better for frame time since it means your HMD is getting the frame quicker, but having consistent frame pacing is important too, since wild fluctuations make for a choppy experience. And there's no issue here, as I have seen in some runtimes before. The 4090 is just doing slightly better overall, but it has a few notable spikes the 5090 avoids despite, again, double the render resolution. I want that insanity to really sink in because there are even sillier cases we have to look at on this list. Next up is not one of those, but it's a big game, Skyrim VR with Mad God's overhaul from February 3rd, using stock settings except for disabling mantilla and enabling depth culling since it can help avoid being CPU bound from testing prior versions. And the results here are interesting, but kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, at 100% resolution, the 5090 hits a very key threshold of maintaining above 90 FPS average despite such a heavy area, with the lows almost at 80 FPS too, and it was even slightly hertz limited in my benchmark scene, briefly hitting 120 at points. But while that means a stable 90 FPS is possible where it wasn't before, versus the 4090, it's only a 22 to 24% increase depending on the metric. Disappointingly small. Upping to 200%, the gains increase but are still on the smaller side, with the 5090 leading by 28 to 34% now. However, yet again, it's hitting an important threshold at 60 to 120 FPS motion smoothing would be pretty doable on the 5090, whereas the 4090 could only think of doing 45 to 90 at this resolution. So even if the gains are, relatively speaking, still disappointing, it is hitting important thresholds that open up options which weren't possible before. Both cards do suffer quite a large drop compared to Project Wingman though as the res scales up, but the fact there's such a gap at least indicates we're not CPU bound. At 300% and above, we're mostly reaching the point where the differences are academic instead of practical. The 5090 starts to flex more, now 47 to 53% ahead of the 4090, but could barely manage 45 to 90 FPS motion smoothing. if one truly wanted that. Still interesting to see the relative gap widen that much. And for 400%, the 4090 doesn't have a run because I was actually VRAM limited there. 300% was already pushing over 22 gigabytes per FPS VR. But would you really want to even play at this low of a frame rate even with the 5090? Still, the fact that 5090 can hit some of those important marks at such high resolutions would open up options like using DLAA without needing to upscale at a lower res like 100% and still get pretty good FPS, or a higher render resolution with upscaling could be used for a similar effect. Options which the 4090 would struggle far more with, and I may take a look at this in a bit of a separate video someday. Here's Open Community Shaders gets DLSS support with a new transformer model, as it could make a great combination with the 5090 here. After those disappointing results, let's have the most ridiculous result of the whole run, Metro Awakening. No, you are not seeing things, and no, I was not VRAM limited. I checked with multiple programs and triple checked the run. At 100% resolution, there's not much to talk about besides the fact the 4090 weirdly had 9% better, 0.1% low. Though the 5090 had a similar lead on the 1% low. The moment we hit 200% res though, the change is unbelievable. The 4090 drops all the way to below 45 FPS average, while the 5090 is sitting at 109 still. The 0.1% low are equally ridiculously better, sitting pretty at 71 FPS, while the 4090 has 27. However, both gaps pale in comparison to the 1% low, where the 5090's 1% low are literally more than triple that of the 4090. Something about Metro Awakening must really love memory bandwidth, because the 5090 is just flexing on the 4090 in every single conceivable way. Compared to some of the other results, in this one single game, I feel like I've jumped an extra 3 generations of GPU performance. Just for the hell of it, if we compare both at 300% resolution, the 5090 up to quadruples the 4090's performance. I know this is incredibly hard to believe, and I had to rerun these many times to check, but there's nothing wrong with the results. They're all correct. Metro Awakening just scales up brutally with resolution on any other card. It happened with my Crystal in a previous video too. This game is the showcase for the true power of the 5090 and what high bandwidth can do. If every game saw increases like this, I wouldn't need to upgrade for 6 years. If we go over the frame time plot for a comparison, there's some cool things to note too. In this specific game, comparing the 100% 4090 run and 200% 5090 run, both were somewhat hertz limited, but despite twice the resolution, the 5090 tended to have noticeably fewer spikes across the whole run. Even in moments where it's doing overall worse, the relative flatness of the frame time graphs tends to simply be better. The notable exception is around 52 to 67 seconds, where the 4090's run is practically a razor thin line, but that's kinda it. In fact, something about this game works so well with the 5090 that if we bring in the 400% run for it and then the 200% run for the 4090 just to laugh at it, we can see the 5090's max res run has, honestly, a similar to even better relative frame time consistency than the 4090's 100% run did. Sure, absolute performance is worse, but the spikes within the run are similar overall. The 200% run for the 4090 is just utterly embarrassing. To come back down to earth with some more average results, we have Riven. At 100% res, the 5090 was slightly hertz limited, but again, margins are on the smaller side with average FPS and 1% low, 24 and 21% better. But in an interesting inversion of prior results, the 0.1% low appear to scale better, as the 5090 is a whole 36% ahead there. In fact, it almost matches the 4090's 1% low of 63 FPS, hitting 59. Both of these cards start getting hit really hard going up to a 200% resolution though. but the 5090 is still at playable frame rates, just barely hitting 70 average versus the 4090 sub 50. And the gap widens with the 5090 now 40 to 43% ahead based on the metric. Below that, the results are again mostly academic, as we're not at playable FPS for anything but 45 to 90 motion smoothing, but the 5090's memory bandwidth continues to show its true potential, as it's over 50% better than the 4090 at 300% res, and at 400% res, it's actually doing more than 20% better in every single metric than the 4090's 300% res is. Riven is a title which supports DLSS, so if you were to override to the transformer model in a high PPD headset, could be interesting at a higher render res. Coming up now is Kayak VR Mirage, which I've organized by resolution instead of card given how many configs I tested here. It has both MSAA, though I don't know if it's ×2 or ×4, but I assume the latter, and TAA, which provided an interesting look at how it scales and the effects of AA, given what's been seen so far. 100% really isn't much to talk about, given how hertz limited both cards were with the most demanding settings, so I didn't bother testing further configurations at that res. But it is worth pointing out the 5090's 0.1% low are 27% better than the 4090, even here. 200% though, things get fun. The 4090's performance with MSAA has absolutely cratered. At the same resolution and settings, the 5090 is literally just shy of 2 times better in every metric. We haven't even gone that high on res, and yet the 5090 is showing just how much better it deals with demanding loads, which cripple the prior king. I had a whole video looking at the effects of AA on the 4090, and MSAA at high resolution was always the #1 thing to kill performance. But the 5090 handles it so well. Despite doubling resolution, its performance has literally barely changed, and it's performing similarly to the 4090 with the vastly more lightweight TAA. Except once more, it's got a 28% lead in the 0.1% low. I don't even need to test other configs for the 5090 at this res with how bulletproof it still is. Shooting up to 300% resolution, the 5090 is just having a victory lap at this point. MSAA is beginning to make it buckle, but despite the huge res, it's still managing FPS that's more than playable for a game like this. 79 FPS on average with tight lows. The 4090 is an embarrassment at barely 34 FPS average with MSAA, clearly far beyond this card's power. However, with AA removed or TAA, the 4090 still holds its own in absolute terms, but it falls just shy of 90 FPS average with TAA, but just jumped to nearly 100 without it. However, that's not even in the 5090's rear view mirror, as now that it's finally feeling pressure from MSAA, TAA and no AA are both solidly hertz limited at 120 FPS and have near identical performance. Though if we compared both TAA runs, the 5090 is only about 25% better in the lows, but it jumps to 39% ahead on average FPS. If 400% is, I don't really know how I can say what hasn't already been said, but it's slightly hertz limited with TAA, and it's ahead of the 4090 by 44 to 51% at this high refresh rate. It does really manage to flex though. As if the fact it finally took this higher res and MSAA to bring the 5090 under 60 FPS average, when the 4090 gave that up at half the resolution wasn't enough of a flex. It's just amazing how resistant the 5090 is to MSAA in this game versus the 4090. Still, as long as you don't use MSAA, the 4090 is still providing a fantastic experience at an incredibly high resolution, but only the 5090 delivers a true high refresh rate experience at a high res. And a flat to VR mod, since my primary one doesn't work right now, I want to get some Unity Engine testing. Outer Wilds. 100% is too limited on both cards, but the 5090 has a slight edge on lows. 200% and up is where the cards differentiate. The 5090 is showing surprisingly high margins even at this point, and despite hertz limits, the 4090 has fallen below 90 FPS on average, while the 5090 is comfy at near 120. A 40% edge. The lows rose similarly by 43 to 48%. Amusingly though, the 0.1% low are so good with the 5090 here. They're just a few percent behind the average FPS of the 4090. At 300%, the 5090 just continues to show its superiority, managing to maintain 90 FPS average while the 4090 is down at 60. Interestingly, the 0.1% margin doesn't change, despite now actually being better than the 4090's average FPS, but the 1% has a ridiculous 63% edge. 400% is just a blowout. Now the 4090 can't even keep 45 FPS for motion smoothing, while the 5090 is still sitting comfy at 73 FPS, which is still totally playable and a pleasant experience. Performance is so much better that the 0.1% low of 54 FPS is a whole 25% better than the 4090's average. Kind of crazy to think about that the 5090 is playable without reprojection all the way to 400%, while the 4090 has to rely on it anywhere over 200. These are the kind of gains that, even if not as silly as Metro, lead to a significantly better experience, the likes of which I think would make enthusiasts want to upgrade if it is seen more often. Coming near the end here, there's Red Matter 2. A good looking game, but still highly optimized, and it shows in these results. Skipping to 200% as 100% is 2 Hz limited, the 4090 is somewhat frame rate limited, but the lows on the 5090 are just ridiculous. The 1% low is literally 114 FPS out of a possible 120. I think this is the tightest consistency I've ever seen in a VR game when doing these benchmarks. Practically speaking, the 4090 is still delivering a solid experience since even its lows are 85 and 75 respectively, which is excellent frame pacing still. However, much like Metro Awakening before it, once we cross a certain threshold, the 4090 slams hard into a wall and performance nosedives. Jumping to 300% sees the lows of the 4090 literally cut in half. Its average FPS is now 70, while the 5090 is still heavily Hertz limited, even at 300% res. Hell, despite tripling the resolution, 100% res with it is only 14 to 20% better on the lows. But those lows are still so absurdly good, you'd still hardly notice dips. The headroom on this is massive, and nothing shows this better than at 400%. The 4090 has fallen off a cliff here. It's at barely playable with reprojection frame rates, holding only 46 FPS on average. But the 5090's performance is quite literally multiplicative of the 4090 at the same res, nearly hitting up to 3x better on the 1% low. In fact, just to show how unfair this comparison is, if we look at the 5090 at 400% versus the 4090 at 100%, the 4090 is only 18% better in the 1% low and 31% in the 0.1% low. The latter is a sizable margin, but considering the 5090 is rendering 4 times the resolution, having only a 31% lead in anything is just embarrassing. I want to again make this clear. This is not a VRAM limitation. This has happened in multiple games now, and if it was VRAM limits, those lows in the 30s would be lows at 3. And lastly is VRChat, where I have a lot to talk about, but also some asterisks. Given the nature of VRChat's normal usage, trying to reliably benchmark a normal lobby without 2 PCs running at the same time just doesn't really work. So for the sake of trying to find a reliable, somewhat real world example, I checked out some popular worlds, asked some people, and settled on Complex 7 after some testing. It's demanding with some varied environments. The nature of VRChat content can make it hard to generalize, but I think this is the best I could do within my means in trying to avoid CPU bound worlds. Starting at 100%, the 5090 is literally not affected by no AA or MSAA times 4 and was soundly Hertz limited despite the dips in lows, while the 4090 is already showing signs of faltering. The 4090 wasn't meaningfully changed by no AA or MSAA times 2, so it's not on here as I need the space. But MSAA times 2 is about 18% better than times 4 with it, a small but still meaningful gap. MSAA times 2 isn't that far behind times 4 with the 5090, but the newer card is about plus 10 to 15% in the 1% low and average FPS, with those margins doubling versus the 4090 with ×4. The moment we jump to 200% though, the 4090 just collapses like a house of cards using anything but no AA to such an absurd degree that the 5090 with MSAA ×4 is doing slightly better than the 4090 without any AA. And lighter runs are lightly hertz limited since they hit 120 FPS in a few segments of the run. But we can see that the 5090 is just shockingly resilient to the normal toll MSAA puts on the 4090. Disabling AA entirely only gives the 5090 around plus 18 to 25%, which definitely matters since it brings the 5090 to triple digit average FPS. But the 4090 going from MSAA ×4 to no AA, literally every single metric increases by plus 70 to 90%. This is the difference between 42 and 80 FPS. Even just going to ×2 versus ×4 is a difference between nearly unplayable low 40s and barely cracking 60. 300 and 400 may as well just be the 5090 desecrating the 4090's corpse with how far ahead it is. I don't think I really need to point out that the other margins when 400% res with MSAA ×2 on the 5090 is doing 26 to 43% better in the lows than the 4090 at 300% with no AA. But because the sheer performance disparity is hilarious, I'm going to point out anyway and say that at 300% res and comparing the no AA runs, the 5090's lows are roughly double that of the other card, and even the average FPS rises by 61%. Once again, we're seeing that at lower resolution, the gap isn't that large, but the 5090 is far more resistant to the demands of high resolution, where the 4090 dives off a cliff at a point. And it's not VRAM related. So, there's the data and some real shocking numbers in there, I'd say, right? Well, before we get to the conclusions, though, let me briefly explain why we see some of these numbers, as I'm sure you're quite curious and I said I was going to do this here. After all, when the 5090 was only about 30% faster than the 4090 on average at 4K, and games are fully GPU bound most of the time, seeing 50% to even literally multiplied gains at high-res VR, it must be a pretty big shock. Well, I have mentioned it a few times, but the most likely culprit is the immense increase in memory bandwidth that the 5090 has, as this is the only stat that quantum leaps over the 4090. Look at these stats taken from Tech Power Up. If you compare most of the render config, most of it's around 20 to 30%-ish better, and the clock speed on the 5090 is even somewhat lower than the prior gen flagship. But note the bandwidth. 1.01 terabytes per second versus 1.79. That's a near 80% increase. But why does it matter, and how does it explain the 5090 only being 30% better at flat screen, but able to have these edge cases where it's 3 times faster in VR? Okay, so in very simple terms, memory bandwidth is not exactly how fast the card processes the data in VRAM, more so how much in VRAM it can access to process at once in a given time, and then let the processing components actually do stuff with that information. To make a bit of a reductive comparison, think of it like having a big truck carrying a bunch of goods for the workers to unload. The truck represents the bandwidth and data, the workers the raw computational power. The bigger the truck, the more stuff it can bring in one trip to be unloaded. But it doesn't matter how much you can fit on the truck if you have so few guys it takes forever to unpack them, though. In this case, the raw compute is more of a bottleneck. But if you have so many guys unloading a small truck, lots of them sit around because there's nothing to do, then you're bottlenecked more by the bandwidth and how much you can bring in at once. At a comparatively low res like 4K, it's more likely that there's just not enough information there for the 5090 to saturate all the cores, and that's the problem it has, because it's not bandwidth limited. However, at the Omega high-resolution high-end VR headsets have, there is a lot more data, and some VR headsets are reaching triple, quadruple, even more than that over 4K resolution. So bandwidth becomes more of a bottleneck in that case, especially on an incredibly compute powerful card like a 90 class one. And that's why the 5090 can become so disproportionately powerful at high resolutions, whereas the 4090 just kind of falls off a cliff at certain points, because while the 5090 is able to keep computing, the 4090 just hits a wall waiting for that truck's return trip. That's extra time spent waiting and thus performance lost, at least from my understanding. I do a lot of research, but I'm also not an architectural engineer or anything. So, with that context out of the way, let's talk about the conclusions and if the thing is worth it. Because, oh boy, the unique situation of this card makes it kind of a tricky recommendation. Because I think there's two major cases to look at for this card given those properties of high memory bandwidth. Obviously, this is assuming you can even get one, because supply is really bad right now. Simply put, this card sees the most value on the enthusiast high-end headsets pushing extreme resolution. If you're playing on something like, say, the Quest 3, I used here at the lowly resolution of about 3K by 3K per eye VD Ultra has, this card probably isn't going to get you much value, as in those cases, where I wasn't Hertz limited at least, the gap was more in line with the usual flat screen findings of around plus 25 to 35%. Almost any other card will be a sizable improvement if you're not on a 4090, but if you're on one already, I don't think it's really worth it unless you are really keen on hitting certain thresholds like, say, Skyrim had despite the lower than average gains. Enabled a couple things which the 4090 just couldn't do. But if you're on something that's on the high resolution side, such as, say, somewhere between the Vario Aero or the Pimax Crystal here, oh boy, this card suddenly gets way more compelling. That general territory is where the gains of plus 40 to 50% or even higher begin to crop up. And then the jump begins to resemble what we saw with the 3090 to 4090. And if you're somebody who's planning for even higher resolution HMDs, such as the Crystal Super, you love to super sample in VR because it's really amazing, or you like to also use MSAA at high resolutions, well, then things just kind of get really silly with the gains, because that can go into the 70% plus territory over the 4090, all the way up to, in some edge cases, doubling or tripling performance. Like, say, with Metro Awakening 2 or Red Matter 2, which I just think is utterly insane to think about. In those cases, this card is the savior of high-res PCVR headsets, because it enables things at resolutions, at settings, the likes of which you just simply would not be possible before. It makes some of those stupid high-res headsets suddenly far more viable, long as they have a decently efficient compositor. Yes, again, that can definitely affect results, so I want to make this very clear. These are not one-to-one comparable to every headset, but some of the stuff this card did in the video being even possible is simply great, and the broad trend of the 4090 hitting a wall over a certain res, I have seen that on my Pimax Crystal here too, so that general idea is probably applicable to VR in general. I will be testing that just to be certain though. And yes, in the case of something like Metro Awakening, we saw ridiculous gains without going to that unrealistic a res. But it was the exception though, as generally it was around 300% res or 200% with heavy MSAA, where the 5090 started to pull ahead by that massive margin, which made the upgrades look so compelling. If you are one of those enthusiasts with a high-end headset and a budget to match, well, then the 5090 can give performance that even the previous King just cannot touch at all. But the price is really getting steep. It just seems to be getting higher now. The most expensive models of this thing is getting close to the cost of a cheap used car. Unless you get lucky selling your old 4090 to recoup most of the cost with how high they're selling for, and grab the 5090, that's a big ass to make. But I'm not going to lie and say I didn't find this thing worth it. I expected some extra gains with the memory bandwidth, but not like this. However, not all is good for the new god of VR. At the time of this writing, there appears to be quite a few issues with the 5000 series or its driver, VR or not. Several headsets work in glitchy ways, like the Vario Aero and the Pimax Crystal having issues getting display output. I'm on the 4090 right now recording this. But I've heard some users report success in getting the Crystal to work by disabling the NVIDIA audio driver, but then, hey, no headphones. And when I tried the PSVR 2, I had some weird frame pasting issues, and then when I tried to record with FPSVR and OBS, it abruptly caused serious frame time spikes on the Quest 3. And that's not to mention the several games simply not working for me anymore. or stuff like the smooth motion turning itself on. There is an early adopter tax for the 5090, if you're even lucky enough to get one. And it's heavy. But if you can work around that or have a headset which plays nice with it right now, like the Quest 3, you can have a good time. Just maybe be careful and don't expect plug-and-play experiences. Even besides my issues, there are some stories of 5090s dying from driver updates. And there's the video. Boy, the 5090 was sure a pleasant surprise for VR performance after everyone was doom posting about the lackluster flat-screen games, am I right? But I get to say, I told you so about the bandwidth. I kept saying this was likely going to happen, but even I was surprised at how big it was. What'd you think of the results? Surprised? Did I convince you to get one now and join the rat race? Let me know down in the comments below. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you for watching and consider subscribing to see what I do next. Before I sell my old card, I'll be taking a further look at the 4090 versus 5090 on the Crystal, as a workaround for that was found for the 5090, but this was only after I finished all of my testing. Also, we'll be taking a deep look at the 5090 on the Crystal Super when it arrives. Lots of content planned for there, such as testing things like how the card performs with upscaling at such high resolutions, as it could make a pretty great combination. I'm in the beta for that, and so should hopefully have it in the not too distant future, but we'll see what happens. Stick around for that if you're curious. And if you don't, well, maybe I will see you again in the recommended sometime. Later.